My sister married a billionaire. I was not invited. You are an embarrassment, she told me. So I stayed home. 1 hour into the ceremony, the security detail arrived at my door. The groom requests your presence immediately. My name is Zoya, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful corporate executive, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Today was supposed to be the day my family secured their place in high society. Instead, it became the day I burned their fake kingdom to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. The air in my bedroom felt thick and suffocating as I stood in front of the full-length mirror. I was half-zipped into a modest navy blue gown. It was nothing flashy, just a simple, elegant dress I had purchased with my own money to wear to my younger sister Chloe's wedding. I was smoothing out the heavy silk fabric over my hips, finally feeling a tiny spark of excitement for the day when the solid wooden door to my bedroom flew open with a violent crash. It hit the wall so hard the framed degrees I had earned rattled against the paint. My mother, Beatrice, stormed into the room like a hurricane. She did not knock. She never knocked when it came to my personal space. Her face was twisted into a scowl that I had known my entire life. Before I could even ask what was wrong, she lunged at me. Her manicured hands grabbed the delicate fabric of my dress by the shoulders, and she yanked it downward with incredible force. The zipper snagged and bit into my skin, but my mother did not care. She stripped the gown off my body, tossing a faded, oversized gray sweater at my face. "Take it off right now," she commanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Your cousin Tiana needs this dress for the society photos today. Tiana spilled her morning drink all over her own outfit and she needs to look perfect for the cameras. You are staying home anyway." I stood there in my undergarments, clutching the old sweater against my chest. "Mom, I paid for this dress," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm despite the sting of her fingernails on my shoulders. "I am supposed to be at the church in 1 hour." My mother laughed, a harsh and bitter sound that echoed in the small room. "You are absolutely not coming to this wedding, Zoya. Look at yourself. Your dark skin, your natural hair, and your blunt mouth will completely ruin Chloe's royal moment. We are presenting a united, flawless front to the Sterling family today. They are royalty in our community. They expect excellence. They expect grace. They do not expect someone who looks and acts like a common workhorse. Tiana needs the dress more than you do. You would just blend into the background anyway, or worse, you would embarrass us in front of the guests." Right on cue, the golden child herself walked into my room. Chloe was 29 years old and glowing with the kind of artificial perfection that costs thousands of dollars to maintain. She was already in her bridal robe, but around her neck sat a $50,000 diamond set that the Sterling family had gifted her as a welcome present. The diamonds caught the light from my window, sparkling brightly against her flawless makeup. Chloe looked me up and down with absolute disgust. She crossed her arms, the massive engagement ring on her finger flashing aggressively. "You really thought you were going to sit in the front row with the Sterling family looking like that?" Chloe sneered. "You do not belong in high society, Zoya. You never have. Just stay in your little paper-pushing lane where you belong. You are an embarrassment to me." I looked at my sister, watching the cruelty dance in her eyes. I had spent my entire life protecting her, bailing her out of trouble and fixing her messes. Yet here she was, treating me like dirt on the bottom of her expensive bridal shoes. The colorism and favoritism in our household had always been blatant. My mother worshipped Chloe for her lighter complexion and loose curls, grooming her perfectly for the elite social circles of Atlanta. Meanwhile, my deep brown skin and tightly coiled hair were treated as flaws to be hidden away. "I already handled the situation anyway," Chloe continued, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "I told Julian's mother, Vivian Sterling, that you are currently in a rehab facility. I told her you have severe substance abuse issues and that we are praying for your recovery. It was the perfect excuse for your absence. It makes our family look compassionate, and it keeps you far away from the cameras. So do not even think about showing up and ruining my perfect lie. Do not embarrass me in front of my new billionaire husband. I did not cry. I did not scream. 10 years ago, words like that would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. 10 years ago, I would have begged for their love and acceptance. But today, I simply felt a profound sense of clarity. Through my silence, the reality of our family dynamic was glaringly obvious. Chloe was the perfect Spelman girl. She had pledged a prestigious sorority, networked at all the right galas, and played the role of the ultimate African-American elite princess. She knew exactly how to smile, how to laugh at the right jokes, and how to manipulate wealthy men. The Sterling family was the ultimate prize. They were a legendary real estate dynasty, controlling billions of dollars in commercial properties across the country. They funded hospital wings and hosted charity balls that dictated the social hierarchy of the entire city. Marrying Julian Sterling was Chloe's crowning achievement. Meanwhile, I was the family secret. I was the dark-skinned, serious older sister who did not care about sorority parties or country club memberships. I cared about numbers. I cared about hard work. My family saw my quiet dedication as a sign of failure. They thought my long hours working from my home office meant I was just a low-level clerk struggling to get by. They thought my lack of designer labels meant I was broke. They saw me as the ugly duckling, the workhorse whose only purpose was to absorb their stress and fund their mistakes whenever they overspent their superficial budgets. They had spent my entire life taking my resources while simultaneously telling me I was worthless. They demanded my help, but denied my existence whenever it mattered. Tiana. My cousin hovered in the hallway outside my bedroom. She looked nervous but greedy, eyeing the navy gown my mother still held in her hands. I looked at Tiana, then at my mother, and finally at Chloe. I reached out and gently took the navy dress from my mother's tight grip. For a brief second, Beatrice looked ready to fight me for it. But I simply folded the dress neatly and handed it directly to Tiana. "Take it," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I hope it fits you perfectly for all those high society pictures today." Tiana snatched the dress and scurried away without a single word of thanks. My mother looked at me with narrow eyes, clearly suspicious of my calm compliance. She had come in here expecting a massive fight. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to beg. She thrived on making me feel small. By handing over the dress without a single tear, I had robbed her of her usual power trip. "Just make sure you stay out of sight," Beatrice snapped, pointing a sharp acrylic nail at my face. "Do not post anything on social media. Do not call anyone. You do not exist today. Do you understand me?" Chloe adjusted her diamond necklace and smiled coldly. "Thanks for finally doing something right, Zoya. Have a great day sitting in your messy room. Try not to think about how much better my life is than yours." I watched them leave. I stepped back and firmly closed my bedroom door. I turned the lock until it clicked securely into place. The house grew quiet as they hurried downstairs to head to the lavish wedding venue. I walked over to my desk, picked up the faded gray sweater my mother had thrown at me, and tossed it straight into the trash can. I sat down in my ergonomic office chair and opened my secure laptop. I typed in a complex series of passwords and accessed a heavily encrypted financial database. The screen illuminated my face with lines of green and white text. I opened a file labeled Sterling Real Estate Empire. Highly classified financial profiles, offshore account balances, and corporate acquisition strategies scrolled across my monitor in real time. As the executive of the firm that audited their entire dynasty, I had unrestricted access to every single dollar the Sterling family possessed. I reviewed the background check file that Julian Sterling had personally ordered me to compile on his new bride. The file contained every lie, every hidden debt, and every dirty secret Chloe thought she had buried forever. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deep breath. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. "Enjoy the wedding, Chloe," I whispered to the empty room. Enjoy the flowers and the champagne and the cameras. You have absolutely no idea who you are actually marrying today. But more importantly, you have no idea who I really am. You think you left the family failure behind in this room. You think you won the ultimate prize. But you are walking straight into a financial execution, and I am the one holding the axe. 30 minutes passed since the heavy front door had slammed shut, plunging the house into a profound, echoing silence. Zoya remained seated in her ergonomic office chair, the glow of her dual monitors casting sharp shadows across her face. The encrypted financial files of the sterling real estate empire were still open on her screen, a digital map of wealth power and hidden liabilities. She was meticulously cross-referencing Julian Sterling's personal asset portfolios when a sudden violent vibration shattered the quiet of her bedroom. Her personal cell phone, resting on the edge of the mahogany desk, buzzed aggressively against the polished wood. Zoya did not immediately reach for the device. She let it vibrate, watching the caller ID flash across the screen. It was a text message from her father, Pastor Thomas. He was the highly respected, charismatic head of Greater Hope Ministries, a man who commanded the attention of thousands every Sunday morning with his booming voice and impeccably tailored suits. Zoya knew exactly what the message would not say. He was not texting to apologize for her mother's vicious behavior. He was not texting to check if she was all right after being brutally uninvited from her only sister's wedding. He was not texting to express any form of paternal affection. She slowly picked up the phone, her thumb sliding across the screen to unlock it. The message was short, demanding, and entirely devoid of basic human decency. Transfer $25,000 to my account right now. The caterers are threatening to withhold the vintage champagne because my credit card declined. Do your duty as a sister. Zoya stared at the glowing text, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. She read the words over and over, letting the sheer unfiltered audacity of his demand wash over her. $25,000. Her father was casually demanding an amount of money that took most working-class people an entire year to earn, all to pay for fermented grape juice to impress a room full of billionaires. The caterers at the Sterling wedding were top-tier luxury professionals. They did not operate on faith, and they certainly did not operate on credit. If the card declined, the champagne stayed in the cellar. Pastor Thomas was likely sweating straight through his custom tuxedo right now, absolutely terrified that Julian's mother, the formidable Vivian Sterling, would discover that her new in-laws were actually flat broke. Do your duty as a sister. The phrase echoed in Zoya's mind, a toxic mantra that had governed her existence for nearly a decade. She minimized the Sterling corporate files on her laptop and opened a hidden password-protected folder labeled Family Liabilities. The screen populated with neatly organized spreadsheets revealing the true hidden dynamic of the so-called elite family. Zoya was not just a paper pusher working a dead-end administrative job, as they so loved to tell their wealthy friends. She was the invisible pillar holding up their entire fabricated kingdom. For 7 long years, she had secretly funded this family's extravagant high society lifestyle with the profits from her auditing firm. She scrolled down to a specific ledger entry dated 5 years ago. It was the darkest chapter of Pastor Thomas's career, a chapter only Zoya and a few nervous church elders knew about. Her father had always preached about financial blessings, divine favor, and the importance of tithing. But behind closed doors, his divine favor was funded by embezzlement. When the church board had demanded a sudden forensic audit of the building fund, Pastor Thomas had panicked. He had secretly drained the accounts to finance his offshore gambling habits and to lease a brand-new Bentley, desperate to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth among Atlanta's religious elite. He had shown up at Zoya's small apartment in the middle of the night, weeping uncontrollably on her cheap sofa. He had begged her to use her financial expertise to fix the books, quoting scriptures out of context to manipulate her sense of familial loyalty. He swore he would go to federal prison if the congregation found out. Zoya had quietly liquidated her early, hard-earned stock portfolios. She had wired $300,000 into the church accounts, perfectly masking the transaction to look like a private anonymous donation. Pastor Thomas had never paid her back. He had never even truly thanked her. The very next Sunday, he stood at the pulpit, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief, and loudly praised God for providing a miraculous financial blessing. Zoya had sat in the back pew, her bank accounts drained to zero, watching him take the credit. She scrolled to the next tab on the spreadsheet, looking at the endless list of expenses logged under Chloe's name. Chloe's entire brand as a wealthy, sophisticated Spelman college girl was a complete illusion financed by Zoya's relentless labor. The exorbitant out-of-state tuition fees, the luxury off-campus apartment rent, the designer handbags she flaunted on campus, the study abroad, trips to Paris, and the incredibly expensive initiation fees for her elite sorority. Zoya had paid for every single item. Chloe had proudly paraded around campus, telling everyone her father was a powerful real estate mogul. She acted like generational wealth, looking down her nose at students who had to work part-time jobs. Meanwhile, Chloe consistently told her sorority sisters that Zoya was just an embarrassing distant relative who worked a pathetic office job and lacked the refinement required to be seen in public. Chloe had leveraged the fake wealth Zoya provided to infiltrate the absolute highest tiers of Atlanta society, eventually using that fabricated status to catch the eye of Julian Sterling. In their eyes, Zoya's money was simply their natural entitlement. They believed it was her cosmic duty to remain in the shadows, working herself to the bone, so they could shine in the spotlight. Zoya's fingers hovered over the keyboard of her phone. The old Zoya, the desperate, unloved daughter who craved even the smallest crumb of validation, would have immediately logged into her banking app. She would have hastily transferred the $25,000 just to keep the peace. She would have sacrificed her own capital to ensure her family did not suffer the public humiliation of a declined credit card at the most important social event of the decade. But that Zoya was dead. She typed her response slowly, deliberately, ensuring every single letter carried the full weight of her finality. "The bank of Zoya is permanently closed, Pastor." She hit send. She placed the phone face up on the desk, leaned back in her chair, and waited. She did not have to wait long. Exactly 10 seconds later, the screen illuminated violently. The phone vibrated across the mahogany surface, the caller ID flashing Reverend Thomas in bright red letters. The instant reaction was entirely predictable. Zoya picked up the device and tapped the green accept button. She brought the phone to her ear, but she did not say hello. She did not say a single word. "You ungrateful wretch!" Pastor Thomas screamed through the speaker, his booming pastoral voice completely stripped of its usual polished charm. He was absolutely frantic, his tone laced with a venomous, panicked rage. Through the receiver, Zoya could hear the chaotic background noise of the lavish wedding reception. She heard the faint, elegant melody of a live jazz band playing in the main hall. She heard the frantic clicking of heels on marble floors, likely the wedding coordinators running around in a state of high alert. Pastor Thomas was clearly hiding. He was likely crammed into a gold-plated bathroom stall or an isolated coat closet, desperately trying to keep his voice down while simultaneously screaming into his phone. "You owe this family." He spat, his breath heavy and ragged. "I am your father. You will show me respect. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? The Sterling family event planners are standing right outside this door holding a final invoice. If you do not wire that money into my account, right this second you are dead to me. Zoya, do you hear me? Dead to me." Zoya listened to the harsh, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. She listened to the ultimate threat of disownment. "You are dead to me." It was a threat designed to strike terror into her heart, to trigger her deep-seated fear of abandonment. But as she sat there in the quiet sanctuary of her home office, wearing her expensive lipstick and surrounded by the undeniable proof of her own monumental success, she realized something profound. She had been dead to them for years. They had discarded her the moment she proved she would not fit into their superficial mold. They had erased her from their family portraits. They had banned her from their celebrations. They only ever resurrected her memory when a massive invoice was due or when their lies required a financial bailout. Pastor Thomas continued his frantic tirade, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his impending public humiliation. "You are nothing without this family, you hear me? You will transfer those funds right now, or I swear to God I will." Zoya slowly pulled the phone away from her ear. She looked at the active call screen, watching the digital timer tick upward. She did not bother to argue. She did not offer a defense, a justification, or a single tear. With a calm, steady finger, she tapped the bright red button, cutting her father off mid-sentence. The silence instantly reclaimed the room. Zoya tapped on her father's contact profile. She scrolled down past his phone number, past his email address to the very bottom of the screen. She pressed block caller. She watched the confirmation message pop up and hit accept. She then navigated to her mother's contact profile. Block caller. She found Chloe's number. Block caller. She found her cousin Tiana's number. Block caller. She set the phone back down on the desk. She closed her eyes and exhaled a long, deep breath. A profound, overwhelming rush of liberation swept through her body, starting deep in her chest and radiating outward to her fingertips. The heavy, suffocating corset of toxic family obligation had finally snapped wide open. She was completely unburdened. The parasitic cord had been brutally and permanently severed. Zoya opened her eyes, turning her attention back to the glowing monitors. She pulled the highly classified financial profiles of the sterling real estate empire back to the center of her screen. She had officially cut off their funding, but she knew that a simple declined credit card was not going to be the end of this. Her family would try to spin a lie. They would try to manipulate the narrative to save face in front of Julian Sterling and his billionaire mother. It was time to make sure they never had the opportunity to lie again. It was time to completely dismantle the illusion. The digital silence in my office lasted exactly 42 seconds before the illusion fought back. I had severed their direct lines, cut off their individual numbers, and erected a secure digital wall. But I had forgotten the massive, chaotic family group chat. The phone screen lit up, illuminating the dark mahogany of my desk with a relentless strobing glow. The group chat, pretentiously named the Atlanta Elite, completely bypassed the individual blocks I had just set on my father's number. My mother, Beatrice, was the first to strike. She did not bother typing out her venom. She sent a series of rapid-fire audio messages, her preferred method of delivering cruelty. I tapped the play button on the first one, letting her toxic voice fill the quiet space of my sanctuary. "You are a jealous, bitter spinster!" Zoya Beatrice hissed through the phone speaker. Her words were slurring, slightly indicating she had already made several trips to the reception's premium open bar. "You could not stand to see your sister happy. You could not stand to see her marry into a billionaire family while you sit alone in your miserable, lonely apartment. You are going to die alone, Zoya. Completely alone. You will never have what Chloe has. Now wire your father the money immediately before you ruin the one good thing this family has going for it. Do not be selfish today of all days." I swiped away the audio message, feeling nothing but a profound, icy detachment. The days of her words drawing blood were over. The screen flashed again, vibrating against the wood of my desk. A high-resolution photo loaded into the chat. It was my cousin Tiana. She was standing in the grand sweeping foyer of the Sterling estate, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. She was wearing my custom-tailored navy gown. The expensive silk fabric strained awkwardly across her waist and shoulders, clearly not meant for her measurements, but she had forced herself into it regardless. She was smiling a wide, arrogant smile, leaning casually against a towering marble pillar. Beneath the photo, she had typed a caption for the entire extended family to see and applaud. "So glad the family trash stayed at the dump where she belongs," Tiana wrote. "Cheers to the beautiful people." Immediately after Tiana's photo posted, her husband Darius chimed in to secure his place in the pack. Darius was a man who had not held a steady-paying job in 4 long years. He spent his days trading volatile cryptocurrency with funds I had secretly funneled into Tiana's bank account just to keep them from defaulting on their townhouse mortgage. He fancied himself an entrepreneur, a business mogul in the making, but he was nothing more than a parasite wearing a heavily discounted designer suit. Just wire the money, Zoya Darius typed, adding a mocking laughing emoji to the end of his demand. We all know you are only good for writing checks anyway. Leave the high society networking to the beautiful people. You would just scare the Sterling family away with your bad attitude. Do your job, stay in your lane, and fund the party. I read their messages, watching the vitriol stack up line by line on my glowing screen. I did not type a response. I did not engage in their petty digital warfare. Arguing with parasites only wastes your own energy and validates their delusion of control. Instead, I turned my attention fully back to my encrypted workstation. I minimized the Sterling corporate files I had been reviewing and opened a highly secured application that connected directly to my private banking portal. This was the master control panel for the Apex Holdings shadow accounts. This was the unseen silent engine that powered the entire facade of my ungrateful family. For years, I had maintained a complex, heavily insulated web of emergency credit lines, direct deposit pipelines, and overdraft protection accounts for every single member of my family. I had set them up anonymously, routing the massive funds through blind trusts and shell corporations so they would never know the miracle blessings keeping them afloat came from the sister they despised. They thought their credit limits were limitless because of their own superior financial standing and divine favor. They believed the banks simply recognized their inherent worth. They were completely spectacularly wrong. I navigated to the primary authorization screen. The interface was sleek, clinical, and uncompromisingly black. I located Pastor Thomas's emergency church credit line first. It was currently flashing an urgent overdrawn warning due to the luxury caterers actively trying to charge the $25,000 invoice for the vintage champagne. I moved my cursor over the master authorization toggle. With one clean, precise click, I permanently revoked the guarantee. I watched the status indicator spin for a fraction of a second before locking into a new state. Next, I found Beatrice's Platinum Lifestyle card. This was the card she used to buy her elite country club memberships, her weekly spa treatments, and the very clothes she wore to insult me at family dinners. I highlighted the account tethered to my personal wealth. Click. The status updated instantly, severing her from my resources. Next was Tiana and Darius's mortgage protection line. This was the invisible safety net that automatically paid their property taxes every quarter and covered their massive credit card minimums when Darius's crypto schemes inevitably failed. I hovered over the cancellation command. Click. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the screen with absolute, unadulterated satisfaction as every single account status changed from a glowing green, approved, to a stark, unyielding red, access denied. I did not just stop the champagne payment. I financially flatlined the entire family tree in under 30 seconds. I severed the invisible umbilical cord that had drained my resources, my energy, and my peace for nearly a decade. I systematically dismantled the financial scaffolding holding up their fake elite status. The Bank of Zoya was officially and permanently eradicated. I glanced at the digital clock in the top right corner of my monitor. The numbers glowed sharply against the dark background. It was exactly 1 hour into the wedding reception. The initial breezy cocktail hour would be wrapping up right now. The hundreds of wealthy guests would be moving gracefully into the grand ballroom for the formal sit-down dinner. The high-end caterers would be running the final authorizations for the premium alcohol packages and the elaborate 5-course meals. The financial shockwave was about to hit my family with the devastating force of a freight train. On my desk, my phone continued to vibrate violently. The family group chat was still exploding with insults, arrogant selfies, and demanding voice notes. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their entire world had just been financially vaporized. They were dancing joyfully on the deck of a sinking ship, laughing and drinking champagne, completely unaware that I had just quietly removed the hull beneath their feet. I reached out to turn the phone face down, ready to watch the offshore routing numbers finalize the massive closures on my screen. The silence of my house was profound, a sharp, comforting contrast to the digital chaos lighting up my devices. I took a deep breath, ready to enjoy the peace I had just brutally reclaimed. Then the silence was shattered. It was not a phone call. It was not a text message. It was a physical, deafening noise that reverberated through the floorboards of my home and rattled the windows in their frames. Boom, boom, boom. A heavy, imposing sound of knuckles pounding on my solid oak front door echoed through the hallway. It was not the polite, hesitant knock of a delivery driver dropping off a package. It was not the casual tap of a neighbor coming to borrow a tool. It was an aggressive, authoritative, and deeply commanding pounding. It was the kind of knock that demanded immediate compliance and promised consequences for delay. The heavy thuds interrupted the digital chaos on my desk, freezing me in my chair. My hands hovered over my keyboard. The real world had just arrived at my doorstep, completely ignoring the fortress I had built. The pounding came again, louder this time, echoing off the high ceilings of my entryway. The ticking clock of the wedding reception faded into the background as the immediate physical threat demanded my attention. I pushed my chair back from the mahogany desk, the heavy thuds still echoing through the hallway. The frantic digital chaos of the family group chat faded into absolute insignificance against the physical reality pounding against my front door. I did not rush. I took a slow, calculated breath, smoothing my hands down the sides of my simple, unassuming loungewear, and walked down the long corridor. I paused at the security monitor mounted on the wall. The high-definition screen displayed 3 massive men standing on my porch. They were not local police responding to a noise complaint. They were not delivery drivers. They were wearing impeccably tailored midnight black suits, dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and clear, coiled earpieces trailing down their thick, muscular necks. Their posture was rigid, highly trained, and utterly uncompromising. This was elite private security, the kind that only billionaires deployed. I reached out, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and pulled the solid oak door open. The 3 men loomed over me, forming a terrifying wall of muscle and silent intimidation. They were designed to strike fear into anyone they approached, meant to look like an unstoppable, anonymous force. But I dealt with aggressive corporate sharks and ruthless financial predators every single day of my life. I did not flinch. I did not cower. I stood perfectly still, meeting the gaze of the man standing in the center. The lead guard stepped forward, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon light. He glanced down at a digital tablet in his gloved hand, then looked back up at me, his eyes scanning my face to quickly confirm my identity. "Ms. Zoya," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation or refusal. "Madame Vivienne Sterling and the groom request your presence at the estate, immediately." I kept my expression entirely neutral, completely masking the sudden sharp thrill of adrenaline that spiked through my veins. "And if I decline your invitation?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, testing the boundaries of his orders. The guard did not smile. His posture grew even more rigid, his jaw clenching slightly. "We are instructed not to return without you, ma'am," he replied, his tone chillingly polite. "We have an armored vehicle waiting at the curb. We are prepared to escort you securely. We strongly advise that you accompany us voluntarily." The realization washed over me like a wave of pure electric clarity. The bomb had finally dropped. The financial detonation I had carefully set up hours ago had gone off right in the middle of their luxury wedding reception. Vivienne Sterling was Julian's mother. To the rest of Atlanta, Vivienne was the terrifyingly sharp, utterly ruthless matriarch of the Sterling real estate empire. She was a woman who could destroy a politician's career with a single phone call or bankrupt a rival commercial development corporation before breakfast. She ruled high society with an iron fist, demanding absolute perfection, unwavering loyalty, and complete transparency from anyone who dared to enter her inner circle. My family was currently standing inside her sprawling estate, sipping her expensive vintage champagne, completely unaware of the financial guillotine swinging rapidly down toward their necks. They thought they had successfully hidden their embarrassing, unrefined, paper-pushing sister away in a messy apartment. They thought they had outsmarted a billionaire dynasty with a few cheap lies and a stolen dress. But to me, Vivian Sterling was something else entirely. Vivian was a woman who respected raw intelligence, brutal honesty, and flawless financial execution. She was a woman who valued facts over pleasantries, and clearly she had just reviewed the comprehensive, highly classified financial audit her son Julian had commissioned from my firm. She had read the undeniable proof of Chloe's massive secret credit card debt. She had seen the offshore wire transfers Pastor Thomas had attempted to make using the wedding budget. And because my real name was plastered across the executive signature line of that devastating audit report, Vivian had finally put the puzzle pieces together. She knew the invisible, brilliant financial savior who actively managed her family's offshore portfolios was the exact same woman Chloe had just banished from the wedding. The security guards stood waiting on my porch, their hands clasped firmly in front of them, fully expecting me to panic. They expected me to scramble to ask frantic, terrified questions to show fear at being abruptly summoned by the most powerful woman in the state. Instead, I smirked. A slow, dangerous, fully realized smile spread across my face. "Give me 5 minutes," I told the lead guard. I did not wait for his permission. I turned my back on the wall of muscle, leaving the front door wide open to the cool afternoon air, and walked purposefully back down the hallway toward my master bedroom. The time for hiding was officially over. The era of playing the submissive, unrefined workhorse to appease my mother's fragile, toxic ego was dead. I walked into my bedroom and bypassed the standard closet. I completely ignored the rack filled with the cheap, oversized sweaters and drab, shapeless dresses my family constantly forced me to wear. My mother had always insisted I dress down, claiming bright colors and tailored fits were too flashy for someone of my complexion and low status. She wanted me invisible, easily digestible, and thoroughly unremarkable. For years I had complied, creating a physical camouflage to protect my peace and keep her venomous jealousy at bay. I walked to the back wall of the room and pressed my hand against a smooth, inconspicuous wooden panel. A hidden biometric scanner quickly read my fingerprint. A soft mechanical click echoed in the room, and the panel slid open smoothly, revealing the true walk-in closet I had secretly built for myself. The space was massive, brightly lit with custom studio lighting and lined with pristine glass-enclosed wardrobes. The scent of expensive leather and rich cedar filled the air. This was the armory of the CEO of Apex Holdings. This was where the real Zoya lived. Rows of designer shoes racks of pristine silk blouses and velvet-lined display cases filled with luxury timepieces gleamed under the lights. I walked directly to the center island, my heart pounding with a steady, rhythmic anticipation. I was about to shed a skin I had worn for decades. I stripped off the simple loungewear, letting it fall forgotten to the floor. I reached into a protective garment bag and pulled out a stunning custom-tailored Tom Ford pantsuit. It was a rich, deep crimson red, a color that demanded absolute attention and radiated pure, unfiltered power. The silk-lined fabric draped flawlessly over my frame. The sharp, structured lines of the blazer accentuated my shoulders, while the precise cut of the trousers elongated my legs. It was a $15,000 suit designed for a woman who owned the room the exact second she stepped into it. I slipped my feet into a pair of black razor-sharp Christian Louboutin stilettos. The familiar glossy red soles matched my suit perfectly, a subtle but undeniable flex of wealth. I walked over to the jewelry display and completely bypassed the delicate, understated silver pieces. Today required heavy armor. I pulled out a solid gold Rolex day-date, the heavy metal cold and deeply grounding against my wrist. It was a watch that signaled extreme financial success and unapologetic authority. I sat down at my brightly lit vanity mirror. I looked at the woman reflecting back at me. I did not reach for the straightener to flatten my tightly coiled hair to make myself more acceptable to their high society standards. Instead, I picked up a styling pick and fluffed my afro, letting it stand tall, proud, and magnificent like a dark halo. I reached for my makeup bag. I completely ignored the neutral, muted tones I usually wore to blend in at family events. I picked up a tube of bold, blood-red lipstick. I applied it carefully, the vibrant, unapologetic color contrasting beautifully against my rich, deep brown skin. I stood up and took one final, sweeping look in the full-length mirror. The ugly, unrefined sister that Beatrice and Chloe had relentlessly abused was gone. The quiet, pathetic paper pusher who silently funded their fake elite lives was eradicated. The obedient, terrified daughter who absorbed their insults to keep the peace had been completely obliterated. The true Zoya had finally arrived. I was the anonymous founder and CEO of the most ruthless and elite financial auditing firm on the East Coast. I was a self-made multimillionaire who held the keys to the Sterling family's entire financial security. I reached out and grabbed my sleek black leather briefcase. Inside were the hard copies of the devastating audit reports, the eviction notices, and the absolute financial ruin of my toxic family. I snapped the heavy brass clasps shut. The sound was sharp and final, like the cocking of a loaded weapon. I walked out of the hidden closet, my stilettos clicking rhythmically and sharply against the hardwood floor. Each step felt like a deliberate drumbeat signaling the end of an era of abuse and the dawn of absolute reckoning. I walked back down the hallway, my spine perfectly straight, my chin held high, radiating a terrifying, icy calm. The three elite security guards were still standing exactly where I had left them on the front porch. When I stepped into the light of the doorway, their stoic, highly trained expressions cracked for a fraction of a second. The lead guard blinked his eyes, taking in the striking crimson Tom Ford suit, the heavy gold Rolex, the bold lipstick, and the absolute unshakable authority in my posture. He quickly composed himself, clearing his throat and stepping aside to create a wide, respectful path for me. "I am ready," I said, my voice smooth, commanding, and utterly devoid of fear. "Let us go see Madame Sterling." The lead guard opened the heavy armored door of the black Maybach, waiting silently at the curb. I stepped inside, the thick door closing behind me with a solid, definitive thud that instantly muted the sounds of the outside world. The interior of the vehicle smelled of rich leather and expensive detailing. The tinted windows wrapped the cabin in a cool, private shadow. The engine purred to life, a deep and powerful vibration that mirrored the steady rhythm of my own heart. As the massive vehicle glided smoothly away from my curb and merged onto the main avenue, I placed my sleek leather briefcase squarely on my lap. I ran my fingers over the smooth brass clasps. With two sharp clicks, the briefcase sprang open. Inside, perfectly organized and protected by thick cardstock, lay the instruments of my family's impending destruction. I reached past the eviction notices and the banking termination confirmations. I pulled out a thick, meticulously bound dossier. At the very top of the pristine white cover page, stamped in bold, unyielding gold foil, was the crest of Apex Holdings. I traced the embossed letters, a quiet rush of pride washing over me. This was the truth my family was too ignorant to see. I was not a low-level administrative clerk struggling to meet a monthly quota. I was not a pathetic paper pusher hiding in a tiny cubicle. I was the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. My firm was the most ruthless, efficient, and highly sought-after financial auditing agency on the entire East Coast. I did not just work with numbers. I commanded them. I possessed the unparalleled ability to track hidden assets across global borders, expose corporate embezzlement, and restructure the immense portfolios of the global elite. For years, I had actively managed the generational wealth of the top 1%. My client list included powerful politicians, international real estate tycoons, and legacy families whose names adorned hospital wings and university libraries. And I did it all entirely behind a deliberate, impenetrable veil of corporate anonymity. I kept my true identity completely hidden to protect my peace, my sanity, and my capital from the very people who shared my bloodline. I knew exactly what would happen if Pastor Thomas and Beatrice ever discovered the true magnitude of my success. They would not offer congratulations. They would not express pride. They would view my empire as their personal divine right. They would demand seats on my executive board. They would expect me to finance a fleet of luxury cars, fund massive church expansions, and pay for a never-ending parade of high society galas. They would act like parasites latching onto the main artery of my hard-earned wealth and draining the life out of my company until there was absolutely nothing left. So I built a fortress of shell companies, non-disclosure agreements, and strict legal blind trusts. I let them believe I was a failure because their disappointment was the ultimate shield protecting my empire. And sitting at the very top of my elite client roster representing my firm's largest and most lucrative account was Vivian Sterling. Vivian was the terrifyingly sharp, unequivocally brilliant matriarch of the Sterling real estate empire. She was a woman who valued extreme discretion, flawless execution, and absolute financial supremacy. For 3 years, Apex Holdings had been the invisible shield protecting the Sterling billions. My analysts audited their commercial acquisitions, optimized their offshore tax structures, and ensured their wealth remained completely untouchable. Vivian and I communicated through highly encrypted executive channels. She knew the CEO of Apex Holdings as a brilliant, reliable partner. She just did not know my face, and she certainly did not know my last name. That careful separation of my two worlds had remained perfectly intact until exactly 2 weeks ago. I looked down at the gold crest on the dossier resting in my lap. The catalyst for today's reckoning had walked directly into my corporate lobby 14 days prior. Julian Sterling, the handsome groom-to-be and the heir apparent to the dynasty, had bypassed his mother's usual administrative channels. He came to Apex Holdings with a highly sensitive, strictly confidential request. He wanted to hire my firm to run a quiet, incredibly thorough premarital financial background check on the woman he was about to marry. He wanted to ensure that the Sterling family name and their billions were not being tethered to any hidden liabilities, secret debts, or potential public relations disasters. He handed over a file containing his beautiful fiancée's information. I remembered sitting alone in my corner office staring at the glossy photograph of my sister Chloe attached to the intake forms. Because I operate under the strictest non-disclosure agreements in the financial sector, I could not pick up the phone and call Julian to explain the massive conflict of interest. I could not break protocol to warn him that the woman he loved was a pathological liar. And I certainly could not warn Chloe that her future husband had just hired the financial Grim Reaper to inspect her closet. Neither Julian nor Vivian had any idea that the brilliant, invisible financial savior protecting their empire was the older sister of the exact woman Julian was planning to walk down the aisle with. I had to do my job. I assigned my most aggressive, relentless senior analysts to tear Chloe's entire financial history down to the studs. I instructed them to leave no stone unturned, no bank account unverified, and no wire transfer unexamined. What they found was a masterpiece of financial deception. The audit revealed a staggering mountain of secret credit card debt. It exposed massive personal loans taken out under false pretenses to fund the designer wardrobe Chloe used to trick Julian into believing she came from independent wealth. But the most damning discovery of all was the blatant, undeniable embezzlement of the wedding budget itself. Julian had wired $500,000 to Chloe to cover the extravagant costs of the ceremony and reception. The audit proved that the caterers, the florists, and the event planners had never received a single dime. Instead, my firm tracked the money as it was systematically funneled through a series of rapid transfers directly into Pastor Thomas's offshore church mission fund. From there, the money was instantly drained to pay off illegal gambling debts my father had accumulated over the past 6 months. I had personally reviewed the final devastating report. I signed the executive summary, placed it in a secure, tamper-proof black envelope, and had it couriered directly to the Sterling estate just hours before the wedding was set to begin. I looked out the tinted window of the Maybach as the vehicle merged off the highway and onto the sweeping tree-lined avenue that led to the Sterling family enclave. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my mind with absolute clarity. Julian might have ordered the report, but Vivian Sterling monitored every single high-level security audit concerning her family. She must have intercepted the courier. She must have broken the seal and read the devastating background details. She would have seen Chloe's immediate family listed in the initial briefing. She would have seen my name, Zoya, listed as the older sister. And then she would have flipped to the final page and seen my exact recognizable signature, authorizing the destruction of the bride. Vivian Sterling had just realized that the drug-addicted, embarrassing sister Chloe had banned from the wedding was actually the CEO of Apex Holdings. She realized her most trusted financial ally had been treated like garbage by the very parasites trying to infiltrate her family. That was why elite security guards had pounded on my door. Vivian did not send them to arrest me. She sent them to escort her equal to the battlefield. The Maybach began to slow down. The smooth asphalt transitioned into a grand circular driveway paved with imported cobblestones. The massive ornate iron gates of the Sterling estate loomed ahead, swinging open silently to grant us entry. The sheer scale of the property was staggering. The sprawling multi-story mansion was illuminated by hundreds of tasteful golden spotlights. The meticulously manicured lawns stretched out like a green velvet carpet. The driveway was a chaotic, dazzling display of extreme wealth. Valets in crisp white jackets were sprinting back and forth carefully, parking a seemingly endless parade of Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, and custom Bentleys. Flashing lights from hired society photographers illuminated the grand marble staircase leading up to the main entrance. Massive cascading arrangements of white orchids and rare roses draped over the stone balustrades, filling the evening air with a heavy, sweet perfume. It was the ultimate high society fairy tale. It was the physical manifestation of extreme power and elite status. It was everything Chloe had ever wanted, everything Beatrice had ever schemed to obtain, and everything Pastor Thomas had compromised his soul to be near. They were currently inside that glowing mansion, dancing under crystal chandeliers, absolutely convinced they had finally secured their place among the untouchable royalty of Atlanta. I closed the dossier and returned it to my briefcase. I snapped the brass clasps shut, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet hum of the luxury car. I smoothed the pristine lapels of my crimson Tom Ford suit and checked the weight of the gold Rolex on my wrist. I did not feel out of place. I did not feel intimidated by the sprawling mansion or the fleet of luxury vehicles. I felt a cold, absolute surge of power. The Maybach glided to a smooth stop directly at the base of the grand marble staircase. The lead security guard immediately stepped out of the front passenger seat and opened my door. The cool evening air rushed into the cabin, carrying the faint sound of a live jazz band playing inside the ballroom. I picked up my briefcase and stepped out of the vehicle. My sharp stilettos clicked loudly against the cobblestones. I looked up at the towering oak doors of the estate. My family thought they had successfully built a perfect, unassailable kingdom of lies. But paper kingdoms ignite quickly, and I had arrived with the match. I took the first step up the grand marble staircase of the Sterling estate, moving with a deliberate, lethal grace. The cool evening air was thick with the heavy, sweet perfume of thousands of imported white roses cascading from the stone balustrades. My elite security detail fell into perfect, synchronized formation around me. 2 towering guards flanked my sides, matching my pace stride for stride, while the lead guard marched a half step ahead, clearing an invisible path. Valets in crisp white uniforms paused mid-stride, turning away from the line of custom Bentleys and Ferraris to stare at the striking crimson Tom Ford suit cutting through the sea of neutral colors. I did not break my gaze. I did not slow down. I was a drop of fresh blood, moving across a pure white canvas. The massive, intricately carved oak doors of the main entrance stood wide open, leading into a sweeping multi-level foyer lined with Renaissance artwork and towering floral arrangements. A team of frantic wedding coordinators stood near a velvet rope aggressively guarding the gold-embossed guestbook and directing the late arrivals. The head coordinator, a highly stressed woman with a wireless headset and a silver clipboard, stepped directly into my path. She held up a manicured hand, her mouth opening to demand my invitation or ask for my name. She never got the chance to speak. The lead security guard did not even break his stride. He simply leveled a cold, dead-eyed stare at the woman and used his massive shoulder to gently but firmly sweep her out of the way. She stumbled backward against the velvet rope, her clipboard clattering loudly to the polished marble floor, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. I glided right past her, the sharp rhythmic clicking of my Louboutin stilettos echoing off the high domed ceiling like the ticking of a metronome. Ahead of me, a second set of towering double doors guarded the entrance to the main ballroom. These were closed, manned by two of the Sterling family's internal security staff in standard dark suits. They saw my detail approaching. They saw the clear earpieces, the tailored black suits, and the unmistakable, terrifying aura of authorized, unrestricted power. They did not ask a single question. They did not attempt to stop us. They simply grabbed the heavy brass handles and pulled the grand doors wide open. The sheer, overwhelming opulence of the ballroom hit me like a physical wave. The space was cavernous, bathed in the warm, glittering light of a dozen massive crystal chandeliers suspended from a ceiling draped in imported white silk. Dozens of tables covered in fine linens filled the room, adorned with towering centerpieces and silver candelabras. Waiters in white gloves moved silently between the tables, pouring $1,000 bottles of champagne. At the far end of the room, on a raised dais, sat the sweetheart table where my sister Chloe and her billionaire groom held court. To their right, a 10-piece live jazz band played a smooth, sophisticated melody that floated over the low hum of wealthy conversation. I stepped over the threshold, moving directly onto the pristine white dance floor that spanned the center of the expansive room. I gripped my leather briefcase firmly in my right hand, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the financial execution waiting inside. I strutted right down the center aisle. The shockwave was instantaneous. It started at the tables nearest the door and rippled outward with terrifying electric speed. High society guests, local politicians, tech moguls, and real estate barons stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Champagne flutes froze in the air. A sudden collective intake of breath swept through the crowd as hundreds of heads turned to track my progress down the center of the room. The sheer, unapologetic authority radiating from my presence demanded absolute attention. The band leader, playing a gleaming brass saxophone, caught sight of the three massive guards marching down the aisle. He faltered, missing a note entirely. The pianist looked up, confused by the sudden break in rhythm, and his hands paused over the keys. Within seconds, the music screeched to a sudden, agonizing halt. The silence that fell over the cavernous ballroom was deafening. The only sound left in the entire estate was the sharp, measured click-clack of my stilettos hitting the polished dance floor. I kept my chin perfectly level, scanning the room and easily picking out the parasites I shared DNA with. I saw Tiana standing near the premium open bar. Her jaw dropped open in horror, her eyes bulging as she stared at me. The stolen navy gown looked even more ridiculous under the bright chandelier light, straining at the seams as she froze in place. I saw Darius standing next to her, a shrimp cocktail hovering inches from his mouth, completely paralyzed. I saw Pastor Thomas sitting at a prominent family table near the front. The color drained from his face, instantly transforming his skin to an ashen gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he recognized the supposedly unrefined, pathetic daughter he had just threatened to disown. And then I saw her. My mother Beatrice was standing near the edge of the dance floor, aggressively networking with a prominent state senator. She was wearing a heavily beaded, ostentatious silver gown that she had undoubtedly charged to one of the platinum credit cards I had just permanently frozen. She was laughing at something the senator had said, her head thrown back in a display of manufactured high society charm. Then the unnatural silence of the room caught her attention. She turned her head, her deep annoyance at the interruption written plainly across her heavily powdered face. Her eyes scanned the room, following the collective stunned gaze of the billionaire crowd. Her eyes locked onto my crimson suit. The transformation was spectacular. The manufactured high society smile melted off her face in a fraction of a second, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror and visceral, blinding rage. Her hand spasmed violently. The crystal champagne glass she was holding tilted sharply, spilling expensive vintage alcohol all down the front of her silver gown. She did not even notice the stain spreading across the silk. She completely abandoned the confused senator, leaving him standing awkwardly in the middle of a sentence with his hand outstretched. Beatrice lunged forward, her silver heels sinking heavily into the plush white carpet surrounding the dance floor. She pushed past a waiter holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate panic. She could not comprehend what was happening. She could not fathom how the daughter she had successfully banished, the daughter she had verbally abused and discarded just an hour ago, was currently commanding the absolute undivided attention of the most powerful room in Atlanta. She marched directly onto the pristine dance floor, breaking into a frantic, undignified sprint to intercept me before I could reach the head table. She stopped 3 feet in front of me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild and darting frantically to the hundreds of guests watching our every move. She tried to keep her voice down, a desperate failing attempt to maintain the illusion of control, but her vocal cords betrayed her. Her frantic hiss echoed clearly in the dead silence of the ballroom. "What the hell are you doing here?" Beatrice demanded, her face turning an ugly shade of mottled red. "I told you to stay in your miserable apartment." I did not stop walking. I maintained my steady predatory pace, forcing her to step backward awkwardly to avoid a physical collision. My security detail tightened their formation instantly, moving a fraction of an inch closer to me, recognizing the hostile threat. "You are ruining everything," Beatrice shrieked, finally abandoning any pretense of volume control. The sheer, overwhelming panic of her impending public humiliation shattered her facade completely. She waved her arms frantically, turning to address the crowd, and the Sterling family guards stationed near the walls. "Security! Get this crazy woman out of here! She is an intruder!" She reached out with a claw-like hand, intending to grab the lapel of my Tom Ford blazer. She intended to physically drag me out of the spotlight and shove me back into the shadows where she truly believed I belonged. I did not even blink. I did not flinch. I did not brace for impact. I simply executed a smooth, effortless sidestep, gliding past her outstretched hand like she was nothing more than a minor, pathetic inconvenience. The movement was so fluid, so utterly dismissive that Beatrice stumbled forward. She lost her balance and nearly pitched face first onto the polished white dance floor, flailing her arms and barely catching herself as her silver dress twisted awkwardly around her legs. The lead guard of my detail instantly stepped between us. He did not touch her, but he used his massive frame to form an impenetrable wall of solid muscle, completely blocking her access to me. He looked down at her with a terrifying blank stare that made her freeze instantly in her tracks. I paused my deliberate march down the aisle. I turned slowly, looking over my shoulder at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. The hundreds of guests watched in absolute captivated silence. "Touch me, Beatrice, and I will have you arrested for assault before the cake is cut," I said. My voice was not loud. I did not scream. I did not match her frantic, unhinged energy. I spoke in a low, even dangerously smooth tone that carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. The absolute authority in my voice struck her like a physical blow. The threat was not empty, and she knew it. The power dynamic that had defined our entire relationship was completely permanently inverted in front of the most elite crowd in the state. Beatrice stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she stared up at the giant security guard blocking her path. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. She finally saw the suit. She saw the Rolex. She saw the expensive leather briefcase in my hand. And most importantly, she saw the security detail. She realized these men did not belong to the venue. They did not belong to the Sterling family. They belonged to me. She realized I had not come to beg for a plate of food. I had not come to plead for my place in the family photos. I had come to execute an eviction. I turned my back on her gasping, panicked form. I adjusted my grip on the handle of my briefcase and resumed my steady march toward the raised dais. Chloe was sitting frozen at the sweetheart table, her face ashen, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of her chair. Julian sat beside her, looking deeply confused by the sudden intrusion. But I was not looking at the bride or the groom. My eyes bypassed the young couple entirely. I locked my gaze on the table situated directly to the right of the dais. I looked past the imported flowers and the crystal glassware, focusing entirely on the woman sitting at the head of the table. Vivian Sterling sat perfectly still, watching my approach with absolute razor-sharp focus. I was ready to burn the illusion to ashes. My gaze remained locked with Vivian Sterling, a silent communication passing between us across the vast expanse of the ballroom. But before I could close the final 20 yards to the head table, a frantic mass of black fabric intercepted my path. It was Pastor Thomas. My father had sprinted from his prominent seat, abandoning his plate of roasted duck and truffle puree, moving with a desperate, chaotic speed that completely betrayed his polished pastoral persona. His custom-tailored tuxedo was already damp with dark patches of sweat blooming under his arms and across his collar. The charismatic, booming man who commanded thousands every Sunday morning was completely unraveling in real time. He stepped directly in front of me, attempting to block my path to the head table. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darting around the room like a cornered animal. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the expensive silk of my crimson blazer. The lead security guard immediately stepped forward, his hand moving toward the pastor's chest to physically remove him. I raised a single finger, signaling my detail to hold. I wanted to hear exactly what my father had to say. I wanted the crowd to witness the absolute depths of his desperation. He leaned in close, his breath hot and reeking of premium whiskey and pure panic. "Are you out of your mind?" he whispered viciously, the venom in his voice a stark contrast to his holy facade. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight collar. "You are ruining our reputation. Do you know who these people are? You are destroying everything I have built. Go back to the shadows where you belong. Zoya, leave right now and I will pretend this never happened. Wire the money and get out." I looked down at the hand clutching my arm. Then I looked up into his terrified, angry eyes. I did not pull away. I simply stared at him with absolute, unyielding coldness until the realization dawned on him that I was no longer under his control. His grip slowly loosened, his fingers falling away from my sleeve. Realizing that threats and intimidation were utterly useless against the woman standing before him, Pastor Thomas pivoted immediately to his most practiced weapon, public manipulation. He turned to face the hundreds of wealthy, confused guests staring at us. He summoned his booming, theatrical pulpit voice, forcing a nervous, booming laugh that echoed hollowly across the silent ballroom. "I apologize, everyone," Pastor Thomas announced, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of fake paternal sorrow. "Please forgive this unfortunate interruption. My eldest daughter struggles with severe mental illness. She is having an episode. It is a private family tragedy we have managed for years, and sadly the stress of her sister's beautiful wedding has triggered a delusion. Please enjoy your meals while we handle this medical emergency." The gaslighting was textbook. It was the exact same tactic they had used to isolate me and dismiss my worth for my entire life. They painted me as unstable, jealous, and broken so they could extract my resources while denying my humanity. I heard a few uncomfortable murmurs ripple through the crowd of politicians and socialites. A few sympathetic glances were cast toward my father. He was playing the role of the long-suffering, loving parent to absolute perfection. But the illusion was immediately shattered by the shrill, ear-piercing screech of the bride. Chloe could no longer handle the fact that she was not the absolute center of attention. Her fairy tale moment was being hijacked, and her carefully crafted persona of elegant generational wealth evaporated in an instant. She threw her chair back so violently it crashed onto the floor of the raised dais. She stormed down the steps of the platform, the massive cascading layers of her $100,000 Vera Wang gown rustling aggressively. She looked completely unhinged. The delicate crystal tiara pinned into her elaborate updo was slightly askew, and her face was flushed in angry, blotchy crimson that clashed terribly with her perfect makeup. "You ruined my day!" Chloe screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, breathless pitch as she hyperventilated. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, closing the distance between us. "You always do this. You are just jealous. You are jealous because I am beautiful and you are pathetic. You are just jealous because no man will ever look at you." Zoya. She was unraveling in front of the entire Atlanta elite, stripping away the refined, educated Spelman girl mask to reveal the vicious, entitled parasite underneath. She turned wildly toward the head table, frantically waving her arms at her new husband. "Julian, do something, have her thrown out. Call your security and have this crazy woman thrown out right now." The hundreds of guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the bride pitched a toddler-level tantrum on the dance floor. The contrast could not have been more stark. There stood Chloe, dripping in stolen luxury, screaming and crying, utterly devoid of poise. And here I stood, flanked by elite security, wearing a $15,000 suit, entirely silent and completely unshaken. I shifted my gaze from my hysterical sister to the man she had just commanded to destroy me. Julian Sterling stood up from the sweetheart table. He slowly descended the steps of the dais, stepping onto the white dance floor. But he did not look angry. He did not look like a protective groom rushing to defend his distraught bride from a deranged intruder. Julian looked utterly terrified. His face was ashen, drained of all color. He looked exactly like a man who had just realized he had strapped himself to a ticking time bomb. Julian was a sharp, calculating businessman. He had hired Apex Holdings to run the background check. He had read the devastating report I had couriered to the estate. He knew exactly what Chloe was hiding, and now, staring at my face, he finally connected the dots. He recognized the name Zoya from the family tree file. He saw the undeniable power radiating from my stance. He realized that his new wife had just viciously insulted the anonymous billionaire CEO who held the absolute undisputed power to publicly release the audit and destroy the Sterling family's immaculate reputation. Julian stopped 5 feet away from me. He opened his mouth, his jaw working silently, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He did not look at Chloe. He looked directly at the leather briefcase in my hand, knowing exactly what documents were resting inside. But before Julian could utter a single stammering word of apology, a voice cut through the heavy, suffocating tension of the ballroom. It was not loud, it was not screaming, it was a voice of absolute, unquestionable sovereignty. "If anyone touches her, I will personally ruin your lineage." The command echoed from the grand, sweeping staircase that led down from the private VIP balconies overlooking the ballroom. Every single head in the room snapped upward. The remaining murmurs died instantly. Even Chloe stopped hyperventilating, freezing in place, as if struck by lightning. Vivian Sterling, dripping in authority and draped in a custom emerald gown, began her descent. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her diamond necklace catching the light of the chandeliers, but her eyes were cold, calculating and entirely focused on the scene playing out on the dance floor. The power she wielded was palpable. It was a heavy, invisible weight that pressed down on the entire room. This was the woman who had built empires, who crushed rivals without a second thought, and who demanded absolute perfection from her bloodline. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, the sea of wealthy guests literally parted for her. Real estate moguls and state senators stepped backward, lowering their eyes in deference. She walked directly onto the dance floor, her gaze fixed entirely on me. She walked right past Pastor Thomas, completely ignoring his sweaty, pathetic form as if he were nothing more than a stain on the carpet. She walked right past Julian, who lowered his head, unable to meet his mother's terrifying gaze. And she completely, utterly ignored Chloe. My sister stood there, her mouth hanging open, tears streaking her perfectly applied makeup, waiting for her billionaire mother-in-law to validate her, to comfort her, to banish the ugly sister from the premises. But Vivian did not even glance in Chloe's direction. She sidestepped the massive layers of the Vera Wang gown without a single fraction of acknowledgement. Vivian Sterling walked directly up to me. She stopped, looking at the crimson Tom Ford suit, the gold Rolex, and the unyielding calm in my eyes. A slow, genuine smile spread across her sharp features, a rare expression of absolute, profound respect. She did not extend her hand for a formal shake. Instead, the terrifying matriarch of the Sterling Empire stepped forward and pulled me into a fierce, deeply respectful embrace. She held me for a long moment in front of the entire silent, shocked ballroom. "Zoya," Vivian said, pulling back slightly but keeping her hands warmly on my shoulders. Her voice carried effortlessly across the room, ensuring that every single word was heard by my hyperventilating sister and my sweating, terrified father. My brilliant partner. Forgive the delay. I was just reviewing the phenomenal, deeply illuminating report you sent over. I must say your firm's reputation for absolute ruthless precision is entirely well-deserved. The words hung in the air, echoing through the cavernous space. My brilliant partner. The collective gasp from the guests was audible. The realization slammed into the crowd. I was not an unhinged intruder. I was not a mentally ill, jealous spinster having a delusion. I was the honored, highly respected business partner of the most powerful woman in the room. I looked over Vivienne's shoulder. I saw Pastor Thomas swaying on his feet, his hand clutching his chest as he realized his divine favor had just been permanently revoked. I saw Beatrice covering her mouth in absolute horror, her silver dress stained with cheap champagne, her entire fabricated world crumbling into dust. And I saw Chloe, my beautiful golden sister. She was staring at Vivienne's hands resting respectfully on my shoulders. The utter devastation, the sheer crushing reality of her absolute insignificance finally broke her. She fell to her knees right there on the pristine white dance floor, the $100,000 gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. I smiled back at Vivienne, shifting my leather briefcase to my left hand. The delay is perfectly fine, Vivienne, I replied, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. I believe the timing of this audit was absolutely perfect. Shall we discuss the liabilities? Vivienne's smile sharpened, transforming her elegant features into the mask of an apex predator who had just successfully cornered her prey. The absolute silence of the grand ballroom magnified every tiny incidental sound. The clink of a dropped silver fork against a fine china plate rang out like a gunshot. The collective breath of 300 elite guests seemed permanently suspended in their chests. They were witnessing a high society execution, and no one dared to look away for a single second. On the floor, amidst the crushed tulle and expensive silk of her ruined Vera Wang gown, Chloe's brain completely short-circuited. She stared at the impossible scene unfolding directly above her. Her eyes darted frantically between my polished, commanding stance and the terrifying matriarch who was holding my shoulders with profound, undeniable respect. The reality of the situation simply could not penetrate Chloe's deep-seated, lifelong delusions. In her fabricated reality, I was nothing. I was the pathetic, ugly sister who quietly paid her bills, absorbed her relentless abuse, and stayed hidden in the background so she could shine. I was the family trash meant to be kept completely out of sight. She scrambled awkwardly to her feet, her hands shaking so violently that her massive diamond engagement ring caught the chandelier light in a chaotic, trembling disco ball effect. She looked pleadingly at her new husband. Julian was staring intently at the floor, absolutely paralyzed by a suffocating dread, completely unwilling to intervene. Finding no salvation there, Chloe turned her tear-streaked, blotchy face back toward Vivienne. "Mom, what are you doing?" Chloe stammered. Her voice a fragile, reedy whine that cracked under the immense crushing pressure of the silent room. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest, desperate to reassert her fabricated hierarchy and regain control of her shattered fairy tale. "Why are you hugging my drug-addicted sister?" A collective horrified gasp echoed through the cavernous ballroom. Several prominent socialites actually covered their mouths in genuine shock. Calling someone a drug addict in this specific highly guarded circle was not just an insult. It was a devastating character assassination that invited instant permanent excommunication from high society. But Chloe had miscalculated terribly. She was trying to play a petty high school mean girl game in a room completely filled with ruthless corporate assassins. Vivienne Sterling slowly released my shoulders. She turned her body deliberately to face her new daughter-in-law. The look of pure, unadulterated disgust that washed over Vivienne's face was so potent, so deeply lethal, that Chloe physically recoiled, stumbling backward a full step to avoid the radiation of her hatred. Drug-addicted, Vivienne repeated, her voice dripping with an icy aristocratic venom that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. She looked Chloe up and down, her razor-sharp gaze, stripping away the designer dress, the expensive jewelry, and the fake refinement exposing the cheap, fraudulent core underneath. Your sister is the CEO of Apex Holdings. Vivian announced, her voice booming across the silent, captivated audience with absolute, unquestionable authority. She manages my entire family's offshore portfolios. She is the sharpest financial mind in this state. The words hit the ballroom with the devastating concussive force of a targeted missile strike. CEO, Apex Holdings. Those words meant absolutely nothing to Chloe, whose fundamental understanding of finance ended at blindly swiping a credit card I paid for. But to the rest of the room, those words were absolute gospel. The billionaires, the state senators, the tech moguls, and the real estate barons, they all knew Apex Holdings. They knew the legendary, ruthless efficiency of the anonymous firm that guarded the wealth of the elite. They instantly understood the sheer magnitude of power standing before them in a crimson Tom Ford suit. At the edge of the pristine white dance floor, Beatrice and Pastor Thomas froze entirely, the remaining color violently draining from their faces. The words hit them like a runaway freight train. The math was finally adding up in their heads, connecting a decade of lies, manipulation, and financial miracles to this single catastrophic moment of reckoning. Beatrice stared at me, her eyes wide, unblinking, and filled with a sudden, suffocating horror. The champagne stain on her silver dress grew cold against her skin. The platinum credit cards that had just been declined at the country club. The exorbitant mortgage payments that magically cleared every month. The luxury lifestyle she had flaunted for years while mocking my modest apartment. She finally realized that the bank of divine favor never existed. The ugly, unrefined failure she had relentlessly abused, mocked, and hidden away for years was secretly the multimillionaire holding the master keys to the very empire she was desperately trying to leech off of. I was the bank. I was the source. And she had just spent the last hour sending me toxic, abusive voice notes, permanently destroying her only lifeline. Her legs gave out slightly, forcing her to lean heavily against a marble column just to stay upright. The realization that she had just financially executed herself in front of the entire Atlanta elite crushed her completely. A few feet away, Pastor Thomas looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows, watching the executioner place the hood over his head. The heavy sweat pouring down his face was no longer just from social panic. It was the cold, clammy sweat of absolute, undeniable doom. He heard the words, CEO of Apex Holdings, and his mind instantly snapped to the frantic, illegal offshore wire transfers he had attempted to make with the sterling wedding budget just days ago. He remembered the $250,000 I had silently wired to his church accounts to cover his massive embezzlement 5 years prior. He realized that the devastating financial audit Julian had commissioned, the highly classified audit that was about to be read to the entire room, was conducted by his own daughter. He was not just facing public embarrassment. He was facing federal prison, and the warden was the very woman he had just aggressively commanded to step back into the shadows. He clutched his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow, completely trapped by his own insurmountable greed. Near the premium open bar, Tiana and Darius stood perfectly still, their arrogant smirks completely wiped away, replaced by slack-jawed terror. Darius looked down at his phone, likely seeing the rapid succession of access denied alerts on their mortgage and trading accounts, finally understanding that the beautiful people were about to be out on the street. Their parasite host had just revealed herself as the apex predator of their entire ecosystem. Vivian did not give the parasites a single second to recover. She was a master of corporate theater, and she understood exactly how to orchestrate a public execution. She wanted this done publicly, brutally, and permanently, ensuring that the sterling name would never be associated with the trash standing on her dance floor. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers once. She signaled the DJ stationed on the elevated balcony overlooking the reception. The sound technician instantly cut all remaining ambient background noise. The faint hum of the amplifiers, the soft clinking of glasses at the back bar, the rustling of expensive fabric, everything ceased. The silence was absolute, thick, and suffocatingly heavy. A member of the Sterling Internal Security Detail stepped forward from the shadows holding a sleek wireless silver microphone. He handed it to Vivian with a crisp, respectful nod. Vivian took the microphone, tested it with a brief tap that echoed sharply through the room, and then turned back to me. She did not hand it to Julian. She did not hand it to the trembling, pathetic bride who was still weeping on the floor. She held it out to me, officially passing the baton of absolute authority in front of everyone who mattered in the state. I reached out and took the cold silver medal, feeling the hum of the live microphone in my grip. I looked at my mother gripping the marble pillar for dear life. I looked at my father sweating through his custom tuxedo. I looked at Chloe kneeling in the ruins of her own catastrophic deception. "Zoya, my dear Vivian," said her voice, amplified, echoing perfectly off the silk-draped ceiling and reaching every single corner of the grand estate. "I believe you have the audit report Julian requested. Please enlighten us." The heavy silver microphone felt cold and grounding against my palm. I raised it slowly. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice to compete with anyone, because the cavernous ballroom was so dead silent that the soft rustle of my suit jacket was amplified across the estate. Julian asked my firm to run a standard prenuptial background check on his bride. I began, my voice deadly, calm, slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. "It is standard protocol for high net worth individuals before entering into a legally binding contract. A routine sweep of assets, debts, and potential liabilities. It seems my family forgot that paper trails never lie." A low murmur rippled through the back of the room, quickly suppressed by the sheer magnetism of the spectacle. I reached into my leather briefcase, resting it on the edge of the nearest vacant dining table, and pulled out a sleek black folder. It was thick with bank statements, routing numbers, and undeniable proof. I held the black folder up, letting the crystal chandelier light catch its matte finish. "Strike one," I announced, locking my eyes onto Chloe, who was still kneeling on the floor, shivering uncontrollably inside her stolen Vera Wang gown. Chloe claims she is a self-made luxury brand consultant. She tells her Instagram followers and the high society circles she so desperately clawed her way into that she curates high-end lifestyles for elite clients. I opened the folder, flipping to the first tab. The truth. I continued reading the highlighted figures verbatim. Chloe has 0 clients. She has 0 legitimate business income. What she does have is $150,000 in secret high-interest credit card debt. Debt accumulated exclusively from buying designer clothes, renting luxury cars, and staging fake vacation photos to trick the Sterling family into thinking she came from independent wealth. Julian visibly flinched. He took another step away from Chloe, looking at her as if she were a venomous snake that had somehow slithered into his bed. The utter betrayal on his face was absolute. He had fallen in love with a carefully constructed corporate mirage. Chloe reached out a trembling hand to grab the hem of his tailored trousers, begging silently, but Julian violently yanked his leg out of her reach. Julian the First addressed him directly, my voice softening just a fraction for the victim of the fraud. "She did not love your empire. She loved your credit limit. And when the walls started closing in on her, when the collection agency started calling her burner phones, she panicked. Just this morning, mere hours before walking down this aisle to pledge her eternal devotion to you, she attempted to secretly wire that entire mountain of debt directly to my personal accounts." The ballroom erupted into a sharp collective gasp. Financial fraud of that magnitude attempted on a wedding day against her own sister was a level of sociopathic entitlement that even the most ruthless corporate sharks in the room found appalling. "She tried to use my routing numbers to clear her ledger," I explained, snapping the first section of the folder shut. "She thought she could simply transfer her financial ruin onto the sister she banned from her wedding, entering the Sterling family with clean hands and a flawless credit score. Unfortunately for her, Apex Holdings security algorithms flagged and froze the fraudulent transfer before she had even finished her bridal makeup." Chloe buried her face in her hands, letting out a wretched, guttural sob. "Stop," she wailed, her voice muffled and pathetic. "Please stop." But the guillotine had already dropped. The blade was falling, and I was not going to stop halfway. I turned my gaze away from the ruined bride and focused entirely on the 2 people responsible for creating her. Pastor Thomas and Beatrice were standing completely rigid near the edge of the dance floor, The fight or flight response had failed them completely. They were merely frozen, waiting for the executioner to call their names. "Strike two," I announced, my voice dropping an octave, ringing with a lethal authority that made Beatrice physically flinch. The House of Lies. I flipped to the second section of the black folder. I looked past my parents, directing my attention to the large cluster of tables near the front left of the ballroom. This section was populated by the elders, deacons, and prominent donors of my father's massive megachurch. They were sitting in stunned silence, their plates untouched, watching their revered spiritual leader sweat through his tuxedo. Pastor Thomas and Beatrice loved to boast about their massive, sprawling estate in the suburbs, I said, projecting my voice toward the church tables. They use it as proof of their divine favor. They host lavish church retreats there. They film their prosperity gospel sermons in the grand foyer. They tell their congregation that God blesses those who give generously. Pastor Thomas shook his head frantically, his eyes pleading with me. He took a tiny, hesitant step forward, raising his hands in a desperate gesture of surrender. But my lead security guard immediately stepped into his path, forcing him to halt. An estate? I continued, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood, that went into complete, irreversible foreclosure exactly 5 years ago. The eruption of noise from the church tables was instantaneous. Deacons knocked over their chairs, standing up. Elderly women gasped loudly, clutching their pearls in genuine outrage. The muttering escalated into angry, confused shouts. They had poured their hard-earned tithes into my father's pockets, believing his wealth was a sign of holy anointing. They defaulted on every single payment I revealed, letting the truth wash over the angry crowd. They drained their savings to keep up appearances, funneling church money into luxury cars and country club fees instead of paying their mortgage. The bank came to take the house. The moving trucks were scheduled. Their public humiliation was imminent. I closed the black folder and tossed it onto the table. The heavy thud cut through the rising volume of the outraged church members. So I bought it. I stated the absolute reality of my power hanging over the room. I bought the estate in cash directly from the bank using an anonymous shell corporation. I paid off their arrears. I secured the deed. For 5 long years, Pastor Thomas and Beatrice have been living absolutely rent-free in a house that I own. Beatrice let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. She grabbed her throat, looking around frantically at the elite guests who were now looking at her with open, undisguised revulsion. The prominent state senator she had been networking with earlier actually took his napkin, wiped his mouth, and deliberately turned his back on her. They sleep under my roof. I continued stepping closer to them, refusing to let them break eye contact. They walk on my floors, they entertain their wealthy friends in my dining room, and every single Sunday, they stand at the pulpit and tell the entire church congregation that their eldest daughter is a wayward failure. They tell people to pray for my broken soul while sleeping in a bed that my supposedly broken soul paid for. Lies! Pastor Thomas shouted, his voice cracking into a desperate, unhinged shriek. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his holy persona entirely incinerated. She is lying. The devil is speaking through her. Vivian Sterling stepped forward, taking a position right beside me. She did not even need a microphone to make her voice carry. I assure you, Thomas, Vivian said, her tone dripping with aristocratic ice. Zoya does not lie. I have personally reviewed the property deeds and the wire transfers. Your name is on nothing. You are a squatter in a tuxedo. The entire ballroom erupted. The sheer magnificent brutality of Vivian Sterling publicly labeling a megachurch pastor a squatter was too much for the high society crowd to process silently. Laughter, genuine mocking laughter, broke out among the billionaire tech moguls and the real estate barons. They understood the ruthlessness of the business world, and they were watching a masterclass in corporate execution. Beatrice could not take it. The public humiliation, the utter destruction of her carefully curated social climbing fractured her mind completely. She let out a piercing, wordless scream of frustration and lunged toward me again, forgetting the massive security guards blocking her path. She did not make it 2 steps. My lead guard moved with blinding speed, catching her by the upper arms and firmly restraining her. She thrashed against his unyielding grip. her silver gown tearing at the shoulder, the beads scattering across the floor like raindrops. "Let me go!" Beatrice shrieked, kicking her silver heels wildly. "I am your mother. I brought you into this world. You owe me. You owe us." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. I raised the silver microphone to my lips one last time for this phase of the execution. "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice echoing over her frantic screaming. "I paid my debt the day I bought that house to save you from the streets. But your lease expired the moment you tried to destroy my firm to fund this fraudulent wedding. Consider this your official notice of eviction. You have 24 hours to vacate my property." I let the weight of that eviction notice hang in the dead air for a fraction of a second, watching the absolute horror register in Beatrice's wide, tear-streaked eyes. She was financially broken, socially incinerated, and legally cornered. The guard released his grip just enough to let her sag against the marble pillar, a sobbing, defeated shell of the tyrant who had ruled my childhood. I turned my back on her. She no longer mattered. I shifted my gaze across the white dance floor, locking eyes with the man standing rigidly beside the wreckage of his own fairy tale. Julian Sterling stood tall, but the tension radiating from his posture was palpable. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides. He was bracing himself for the final public execution of the woman he had intended to marry. I raised the silver microphone back to my lips, the cool metal, a grounding anchor against the fiery adrenaline coursing through my veins. "But the most interesting part of the audit, Julian, was the $500,000 you wired Chloe for the wedding expenses," I said, my voice projecting with a deadly, unwavering calm that echoed through every corner of the silent ballroom. Julian's jaw tightened so fiercely a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He knew exactly what was coming. I had placed the unredacted financial forensics directly into his hands just an hour prior. But hearing the clinical, devastating truth broadcast to 300 of the most powerful people in Atlanta was an entirely different kind of reckoning. I gestured casually with my free hand toward the breathtaking opulence surrounding us. I pointed to the cascading arrangements of rare white orchids draped over the balconies, to the silver candelabras, and to the waiters standing frozen, holding silver trays of seared Wagyu beef. "This is a spectacular event," I noted, my tone conversational yet laced with lethal precision. "The design is flawless. The menu is extraordinary. It is the perfect illusion of generational wealth and limitless credit. There is just one glaring, unforgivable problem." I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the crowd before bringing them back to my sister. "The caterers were not paid," I announced, dropping the words like heavy stones onto the polished floor. "The florists were not paid. The event planners, the musicians, the lighting technicians, none of them have received a single dime of the $500,000 the Sterling family generously provided." A collective jagged breath was sucked in by the surrounding guests. The elite society of Atlanta operated on a strict, unbreakable code of financial decorum. You could be ruthless, you could be cutthroat, but you absolutely paid your vendors. To steal the very foundation of a high society wedding was a scandal of epic, unforgivable proportions. "Because Chloe took that $500,000. I continued, my voice slicing through the rising tension, and funneled it directly into Pastor Thomas's offshore church mission fund to pay off his gambling debts. The ballroom erupted. It was not just a gasp this time. It was an explosion of chaotic, unrestrained outrage. The tables near the front, the ones occupied by the senior deacons, the board of trustees, and the wealthiest donors of my father's megachurch, descended into absolute pandemonium. Men in custom suits were shouting, slamming their fists against the linen-draped tables. Elderly women were crying out in disbelief, realizing the sacred mission fund they had faithfully poured their tithes into was nothing more than a personal slush fund for a degenerate gambler. The wholly untouchable facade of Pastor Thomas was permanently shattered, exposed as a pathetic scheme to cover up illegal bets placed in underground offshore casinos. My father literally crumpled. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto a velvet dining chair, burying his face in his hands as his congregation turned on him with feral intensity. He was ruined. There would be no recovery, no repentant return to the pulpit, no redemption arc. He was facing federal wire fraud charges, and every single person in the room knew it. On the dance floor, Chloe's entire world was evaporating into thin air. The crushing reality of her public destruction finally severed her last tether to sanity. She dropped to her knees, the heavy silk and tulle of her $100,000 gown pooling around her in a tragic, useless halo of white. She looked up at Julian, her face contorted in a mask of primal, desperate panic. Her carefully applied makeup was completely destroyed, running in dark, jagged rivers down her cheeks. She crawled forward, her manicured hands scrambling across the pristine dance floor, and lunged for her groom. She grabbed the hem of Julian's tailored tuxedo jacket, clutching the fine Italian wool with a white-knuckled, frantic grip. "It is a lie," Chloe sobbed, her voice breaking into a shrill, hysterical shriek that cut through the roaring crowd. She shook her head violently, tears flying from her face. "She is framing me. Julian, please. You have to believe me. She hates me. She has always hated me. She fabricated those documents because she wants to destroy our love. Please, Julian, do not listen to her." She was weaponizing her tears, falling back on the only tactic she had ever known. She was playing the helpless, victimized beauty, desperately hoping that Julian's affection for her would override the cold, hard logic of a forensic audit. She clung to his jacket, pulling at the fabric, weeping with a pathetic, theatrical intensity that might have worked on a weaker man. But Julian Sterling was not a weak man. He was the heir to a multi-billion-dollar real estate dynasty. He had been raised by Vivian Sterling, a woman who demanded absolute loyalty and punished deception with apocalyptic fury. Julian looked down at the woman weeping at his feet. The expression on his face was devoid of any remaining warmth, stripped entirely of the affection he had held for her just hours ago. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no hesitation. There was only absolute, unadulterated revulsion. He looked at Chloe not as a heartbroken bride, but as a parasite that had attempted to burrow its way into his family's vault. He moved with a sudden, violent finality. Julian ripped his jacket from her grip. The motion was so forceful, so filled with disgust, that Chloe was physically thrown off balance. She pitched forward, catching herself on her hands, as Julian stepped back, putting several feet of distance between himself and the fraud he had almost married. "I saw the bank statements an hour ago, Chloe." Julian stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried a chilling resemblance to his mother's ruthless tone. Chloe froze, her hands splayed flat against the white floor, her breath hitching in her chest. Zoya's firm tracked every single wire transfer. Julian continued stepping forward and looming over her, his shadow falling across her ruined dress. "You did not just make a mistake. You created dummy corporations. You set up shell accounts. You routed Sterling Capital through a Cayman Islands offshore fund disguised as a church charity to cover your father's illegal gambling syndicate. I saw the timestamps. I saw the IP addresses. I saw your signature on the authorization forms." Chloe opened her mouth to speak, to launch another desperate, tear-filled excuse, but no sound came out. The air had been completely sucked from her lungs. The realization that the man she thought she had successfully manipulated had been holding the undeniable proof of her crimes for an entire hour shattered her. He had let her walk down the aisle. He had smiled at her during the photographs. He had let her believe she had won, all while waiting for the architect of her destruction to arrive and drop the guillotine. Julian leaned down slightly, his blue eyes flashing with a cold, unforgiving rage. He delivered the final fatal blow to her grand illusion. "You didn't just lie to me," Julian said, his words sharp and deliberate, ensuring they echoed in the cavernous silence that had fallen over the immediate vicinity of the dance floor. "You stole from my family." The weight of that sentence hung over the ballroom. To steal from a Sterling was to sign your own financial and social death warrant. Julian straightened his posture, buttoning the single button of his tuxedo jacket with practiced aristocratic elegance. He turned his back on Chloe completely, leaving her crumpled and sobbing on the floor. He walked directly over to where his mother Vivian was standing beside me. Julian offered a crisp, formal nod to Vivian, acknowledging her supreme authority, before turning his gaze to me. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a deep, undeniable respect. He extended his right hand toward me. "Thank you, Zoya," Julian said, his voice carrying the calm, professional tone of a man sealing a high-stakes corporate merger. "Your firm's discretion and unmatched efficiency have saved this family from a catastrophic liability. The Sterling Empire is deeply in your debt." I shifted the microphone to my left hand and reached out, meeting his grip with a firm, solid handshake. The business transaction was complete. The liability had been neutralized. "Apex Holdings is always committed to protecting our partners," Julian first replied smoothly, giving a slight acknowledging nod. "The audit is complete. The accounts have been frozen. The threat is eliminated." The finality of my words hung in the chandelier-lit air, a definitive death knell for the fraud that had orchestrated this entire circus. Julian stepped back, officially aligning himself with the absolute power of the Sterling Empire and its new protector, leaving my so-called family completely isolated on the pristine white dance floor. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the shifting dynamics of power, a tangible reshuffling of the social hierarchy right before everyone's eyes. Suddenly, a sharp, ragged intake of breath broke the stillness. "Beatrice." The security guard had loosened his grip just a fraction, assuming the immediate physical threat was neutralized. He vastly underestimated the survival instincts of a cornered parasite. Beatrice did not lunge in anger this time. Her entire demeanor underwent a terrifying, instantaneous metamorphosis. Realizing the gig is up, the screeching, humiliated squatter vanished completely. In her place, a grotesque caricature of maternal pride emerged, painted over a foundation of absolute, suffocating panic. She smoothed down the torn fabric of her silver gown with violently shaking hands, forcefully shoving her disheveled hair out of her face. Her chest heaved, but her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural, trembling smile. It was a psychotic expression, a frantic mask of forced adoration that entirely failed to reach her wide, terrified eyes. She scrambled forward, her silver heels clicking erratically against the polished floor, her arms outstretched as if moving to embrace a long-lost savior. "Zoya, my beautiful, successful daughter," Beatrice cried out, her voice shrill and echoing with a desperate, cloying sweetness that made my skin crawl. The sheer audacity of the desperate pivot sent a wave of fresh revulsion through the ballroom. The elite guests whispered among themselves, visibly appalled by the shamelessness of a woman who mere minutes ago had publicly declared me trash. "I always knew it," Beatrice babbled, closing the distance, her hands reaching out to grasp my crimson Tom Ford suit. "I always knew you were a genius, my brilliant girl. All those long hours you worked. I told your father. I said our Zoya is destined for greatness. You see, Julian, she is a sterling caliber woman." She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically between me, Julian, and Vivian Sterling, desperately trying to tether her rapidly sinking ship to my newly revealed armada. She genuinely believed she could overwrite a lifetime of relentless psychological warfare with a few seconds of frantic flattery. "We can fix this," Beatrice pleaded, her voice dropping to a frantic conspiratorial whisper. Meant only for me, though. The dead silence of the room broadcasted every single syllable to the captivated audience. "It was just a misunderstanding with the funds, Zoya. We can put the money back. You have so much now you can cover it. We are family. Blood is blood. We can fix this. Just keep it in the family." I did not flinch. I did not blink. As her grasping manicured fingers reached for my lapels, I simply took one deliberate step back, looking at her like she was a highly contagious disease. The motion was small, but it carried the immovable weight of a reinforced steel barricade. I examined the woman who shared my DNA with the cold clinical detachment of a scientist observing a particularly repulsive specimen under a microscope. My security detail immediately stepped forward to intercept her, but I raised a single hand, halting them in their tracks. I wanted her to hear this. I wanted the entire room to witness the absolute severance of the toxic tether that had bound me for decades. "Family," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue like poison. I looked down at her trembling, outstretched hands. Those were the same hands that had slapped me when I asked for help with my basic college expenses. Those were the same hands that had lovingly packed Chloe's expensive designer luggage while tossing my modest belongings into black garbage bags. When you manipulated me into paying for Chloe's exorbitant university tuition, I said, my voice slicing effortlessly through her frantic panting. When you bled my accounts dry to fund her sorority dues and European vacations, you called it my duty. You told me that financially supporting my beautiful, talented sister was the only useful purpose my plain, unremarkable life could ever serve. Beatrice's psychotic smile began to fracture her lower lip, quivering as the harsh truth hit the open air. She shook her head frantically, trying to interrupt, but my voice rose, drowning out her pathetic whispered denials. When you sent me that vicious audio message this morning, I continued, taking a step forward now, forcing her to shrink back under the weight of my authority. When you explicitly told me I wasn't allowed at this wedding, that I was forbidden from stepping foot on this estate, you called me an embarrassment. You said my presence would stain Chloe's perfect day. You said I was the ugly secret meant to be kept permanently in the dark. I let my gaze sweep over the crowd, letting the billionaires, senators, and socialites absorb the sheer depravity of the woman standing before them. The judgment radiating from the audience was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket of disgust, settling heavily over Beatrice's shoulders. I brought my eyes back to my mother, stripping away the very last ounce of mercy I possessed. You do not get to rewrite history, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute irreversible finality. You do not get to play the proud, loving mother. You don't get to claim me now that my bank account is public knowledge. You chose your daughter Beatrice, and she is kneeling right behind you, completely bankrupt and utterly ruined. Beatrice physically recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. The reality of her total isolation finally breached her deeply ingrained delusions. She let out a whimpering, broken sound and sank to the floor next to Chloe. The two shattered grifters knelt side by side, weeping in the spectacular ruins of their grand deception. But the reckoning was not yet complete. I turned my attention away from the weeping women and focused entirely on the real architect of this financial and moral disaster. Throughout my confrontation with Beatrice, Pastor Thomas had remained slumped in a velvet dining chair near the edge of the dance floor, paralyzed by a terror so profound it had robbed him of speech. He was sweating profusely, his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket clinging damply to his trembling frame. He had watched his wife humiliate herself, and he had watched his favored daughter's criminal actions exposed to the world. But the true nightmare was rapidly brewing at Table 4. Table 4 was the absolute epicenter of Greater Hope Ministries' power structure. It was occupied by the senior deacons, the board of trustees, and the foundational wealthy donors who had blindly funded Thomas's lavish lifestyle under the guise of holy devotion. For the past 15 minutes, they had been quietly absorbing the concussive shockwaves of the audit's revelations. They had heard about the sprawling estate going into foreclosure. They had heard about the $500,000 brazenly stolen from the Sterling family. And most damning of all, they had heard exactly where that stolen money went. The heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom was shattered by the harsh screech of wooden chair legs violently scraping against the marble floor. The deacons of Greater Hope Ministries, 6 formidable men in dark suits who had once treated my father with godlike reverence, stood up in unison. The synchronized movement was ominous, a unified front of absolute betrayal and righteous burning fury. Deacon Miller, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had served faithfully on the church board for 20 years, bypassed the security detail and marched directly toward my father. His face was purple with unadulterated rage, the veins bulging visibly in his neck. Gambling debts. Miller roared, his voice booming with a terrifying, thunderous authority that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Pastor Thomas flinched violently, shrinking back into his velvet chair, holding his shaking hands up in a pathetic attempt to ward off the impending verbal assault. Miller, please, you must understand the devil attacks those who do the Lord's work. It was a moment of weakness. The mission fund was just a temporary loan. With church funds, Miller bellowed, leaning over my father, entirely ignoring the pathetic, stammered excuses. One of the other deacons raised a hand, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Pastor Thomas's chest. With the money widows and working families put into the offering plate, with the capital meant to build the new community outreach center, you funneled $500,000 stolen dollars through our holy accounts to pay off offshore casinos. The sheer disgust in Miller's voice was lethal. The other deacons flanked him, looking down at their former spiritual leader as if he were the absolute scum of the earth. The illusion of divine favor, the decades of manipulative prosperity gospel sermons, the unshakable moral authority, it all evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a desperate thieving fraud in a sweaty suit. "You are finished," Thomas Miller pronounced, delivering the final crushing verdict. "The board is convening an emergency session tonight. You are stripped of your title. You are permanently locked out of the church. We are freezing every single ministry account, and we are handing all our financial ledgers directly to the federal authorities. May God have mercy on your soul, because we absolutely will not." The absolute certainty of federal prison time, the total loss of his carefully constructed empire, and the irreversible public humiliation hit Pastor Thomas with the devastating force of a physical blow. He gasped loudly, his eyes rolling back slightly as his hand flew to his chest. He collapsed heavily against the back of the velvet chair, his breathing ragged and impossibly shallow. He sat there clutching his chest, a broken man watching helplessly as his entire reputation and his entire life's work disintegrated in seconds right in front of him. The air in the ballroom remained thick and heavy, charged with the electric aftermath of the deacon's furious departure. Pastor Thomas remained slumped in his velvet chair, wheezing, his eyes darting wildly across the room. He was searching desperately for a single sympathetic face among the hundreds of wealthy elites who were now glaring at him with pure, unadulterated disdain. He found none. The men who had previously shaken his hand and praised his televised sermons were now actively stepping away, treating the space around him as a highly contagious quarantine zone. His holy empire had been reduced to ash in a matter of seconds, and the absolute reality of his impending federal prosecution was settling heavily onto his shaking shoulders. I turned my attention back to my leather briefcase resting on the edge of the vacant dining table. The black financial folder had delivered its fatal payload, but there was one final piece of administrative housekeeping required to completely sever my ties to these parasites. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was sealed with the crisp, unmistakable insignia of my firm's elite legal team. The heavy parchment felt substantial in my grip, carrying the weight of absolute binding law. I stepped toward the edge of the white dance floor, stopping just a few feet away from where Beatrice and Chloe were still huddled weeping in a puddle of ruined designer fabric. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the heavy envelope. It landed with a sharp smack directly at my parents' feet, sliding across the polished marble until it bumped against Beatrice's silver heels. Beatrice flinched, staring down at the envelope, as if it were a live explosive. "That is a 30-day eviction notice," I announced, my voice carrying an icy, uncompromising resonance that left no room for negotiation. "It has been filed with the county clerk, signed by a superior court judge, and is fully enforceable by local law enforcement. You have exactly 1 month to get your things out of my house. Every piece of furniture, every tacky chandelier, every single item bought with stolen church money must be removed from the premises." I let my gaze sweep over Beatrice's horrified, tear-streaked face. "After 30 days, the locks will be changed, the security codes will be wiped, and anything left behind will be tossed directly into a dumpster. You are officially out on the street." I turned my eyes to Pastor Thomas, who was still clutching his chest, his face a sickly, pallid shade of gray. The sweat was dripping from his chin onto his ruined tuxedo collar, staining the crisp white fabric. "And Pastor," I added, leaning forward just enough to ensure the promise of utter destruction registered in his panic-stricken eyes, "you better hope the IRS doesn't see the file I just forwarded to them." The mention of the IRS was the ultimate inescapable death blow. The remaining color drained completely from his face. He knew the offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, the tax evasion, and the illegal gambling wires were all meticulously documented within the digital files my firm possessed. He let out a low, whimpering groan and slumped forward, entirely broken. The execution was complete. I had dismantled a decade of abuse, theft, and manipulation in a matter of minutes. Julian stepped forward, moving with the predatory, confident grace of a man reclaiming his territory. He did not look at his weeping bride. He did not acknowledge the groveling pastor or the hysterical mother. He held out his hand, and I passed the silver microphone to him, transferring the command of the room back to the heir of the Sterling Empire. Julian tapped the microphone once. His gaze swept across the expansive ballroom, meeting the eyes of the prominent state senators, the tech billionaires, and the old money matriarchs who had gathered to witness what was supposed to be the wedding of the decade. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian began, his voice projecting with a deep, resonant authority that commanded absolute obedience from the elite crowd. I sincerely apologize for the disruption to this evening's events. However, the Sterling family does not negotiate with thieves, and we certainly do not marry them. He paused, letting his icy blue eyes fall down to Chloe, who was staring up at him with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to beg one last time, but Julian's voice completely overpowered her. "The wedding is cancelled," Julian declared, his tone devoid of any emotion, sealing her fate with absolute finality. A collective murmur of shock and fierce approval washed over the high society crowd. Julian raised his hand, signaling the perimeter of the grand ballroom. "Security!" Julian commanded, his voice echoing sharply. "Escort the bride and her family off my property immediately." Instantly, a dozen highly trained, broad-shouldered men in crisp black suits materialized from the shadows of the ballroom. They moved with terrifying military precision, their expressions blank, their intentions absolute. They formed a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the sobbing, broken family, effectively trapping them on the dance floor. But before the guards could physically lay hands on the trespassers, a frantic figure broke through the crowd near the premium open bar. It was Tiana. My cousin, the one who had so gleefully stolen my custom-tailored dress, was sprinting toward the dance floor. The panic on her face was absolute. She had watched the financial slaughter unfold from the sidelines, realizing with horrifying clarity that her entire meal ticket was gone. The free rides, the luxury vacations, the elite access to the Sterling Empire, it was all evaporating into thin air. She saw the ship sinking and decided to make one last desperate attempt to jump aboard a lifeboat. She shoved past a bewildered waiter, nearly tripping over the hem of the stolen gown. She threw herself toward me, stopping just inches away as my personal security guard stepped aggressively into her path, blocking her advance. She was shaking, her eyes wide and manic. "Zoya! Zoya, wait!" Tiana pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. She forced a hysterical, trembling smile, desperately trying to channel the fake, sweet demeanor she had always used to manipulate situations to her advantage. "Please, Zoya. I had nothing to do with the embezzlement. I didn't know about the church funds or the fraud. You know me, we grew up together. You are the CEO of Apex Holdings, you have so much power." She clasped her hands together in a pathetic, groveling gesture of submission. "Please, I need a job." Tiana begged, tears spilling over her heavy makeup. "Just a small position at your firm. I can assist you. I can do anything you need. We are family, Zoya. Please do not leave me behind with them." I stood perfectly still, letting her pathetic groveling fill the silence. I looked her up and down, taking in the sight of my stolen dress stretching awkwardly across her frame. The intricate beading was pulling violently at the seams, the expensive silk wrinkled and abused by her frantic running. She had tried to steal my armor, but she lacked the posture, the grace, and the intellect to wear it. She looked exactly like what she was, a cheap imitation, desperately trying to wear the skin of a woman she could never be. I did not even break my stride. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice laced with an absolute, uncompromising disdain that made the surrounding guests physically wince. "You look cheap in that dress, Tiana." I said the words, slicing through her desperate pleas with surgical accuracy. "And your character is even cheaper." Tiana recoiled as if she had been struck violently across the face with an iron bar. the fake smile shattered instantly, replaced by a mask of utter humiliation as the surrounding high society guests let out a collective mocking scoff. She looked down at the stolen gown, the reality of her own pathetic parasitic existence, crushing her completely. She had nothing left to say. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. The transaction was over. The liability had been permanently eliminated from my life. I turned my back on her, pivoting smoothly on my heel. I faced the grand exit of the ballroom, my posture perfectly straight, the crimson Tom Ford suit acting as an impenetrable shield of absolute victory. Behind me, the sterling security detail moved in. I heard the sharp, commanding voices of the guards ordering the family to move. Then came the frantic, chaotic physical struggle. Beatrice shrieked a wild, feral sound of pure denial as a guard grabbed her by the arm and hauled her forcefully to her feet. Chloe screamed Julian's name, sobbing hysterically, the heavy train of her expensive, ruined dress dragging across the floor as two guards physically lifted her by her shoulders and dragged her toward the service exit. Pastor Thomas stumbled along, blindly weeping and clutching his chest, flanked by security men who offered zero sympathy for his fabricated medical distress. Tiana was corralled along with them, weeping loudly as she was marched out of the estate. The cacophony of their screams and cries echoed through the grand ballroom, a pathetic dying wail of a parasitic dynasty being violently ripped from its host. The elite guests watched in fascinated silence, sipping their expensive champagne as the trash was officially taken out of high society forever. I walked out of the ballroom, the heavy wooden doors closing firmly behind me. I stepped out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving the weeping, ruined family entirely in the past, and walked directly into the limitless empire I had built with my own two hands. 3 months later, the morning sun reflected off the floor-to-ceiling glass of my corner office penthouse. I sat at the head of a massive polished mahogany desk, breathing in the rich scent of Earl Grey tea rising from a perfectly brewed cup. The Atlanta skyline stretched out beneath me, a sprawling grid of power, commerce, and ambition. Down there, millions of people were hustling just to survive the day. Up here in the pristine, unbothered air of the executive suite, I was the one pulling the strings. The atmosphere in my office was clear, completely free of the toxic, suffocating weight I had carried for over a decade. The transition from the hidden, financially abused sister to the absolute pinnacle of the financial world had been swift, brutal, and flawlessly executed. The fallout from the sterling wedding disaster was instantaneous and catastrophic for the parasites. The Board of Deacons at Greater Hope Ministries did not wait for the morning sun to rise. By midnight of that fateful evening, they had frozen every single church account, revoked all access privileges, and officially ousted Pastor Thomas from the pulpit he had used to fund his degenerate lifestyle. Federal agents descended on the church administrative offices just 2 days later. It was a highly publicized raid. News helicopters circled overhead as agents walked out carrying boxes of hard drives and paper ledgers. My father was immediately placed under a massive, unyielding federal investigation for wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. His passport was confiscated, his assets were frozen. The man who had spent my entire life preaching about divine favor and judging my perceived shortcomings was now facing the terrifying, inescapable reality of federal prison. Beatrice experienced a social and financial death so absolute it was almost poetic. I kept my promise to the exact minute. 30 days after the wedding reception, the locks on the sprawling suburban estate were changed. Beatrice was forced to pack whatever she could fit into rented moving vans and relocate to a cramped, dingy 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city. She now lives in a complex with thin walls and noisy neighbors, a far cry from the gated serenity she once bragged about. Her platinum credit cards were declined everywhere, flagged and frozen by the banks she could no longer pay. The elite country club society she had worshipped and bled herself dry to impress completely excommunicated her overnight. The women who used to drink expensive mimosas on her patio now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Without my silent financial lifeline, she was reduced to a bitter, isolated ghost counting pennies at the discount grocery store, entirely cut off from the glamorous world she felt so entitled to rule. And then there was Chloe. The ultimate karma had finally caught up with the family's golden child. The fabricated fairy tale was permanently canceled, and the reality check was devastating. She was drowning in the massive high-interest debt she had accumulated trying to fake her billionaire lifestyle. With Julian entirely out of the picture and my bank account securely locked down, Chloe was forced to actually work for a living. The former elite Spelman girl who used to mock my unmanicured hands and modest clothes was now standing on her feet for 9 hours a day. She was working as a front desk receptionist at a low-end retail boutique in a dying shopping mall. She spent her days wearing a polyester uniform, organizing clearance racks, and dealing with angry, screaming customers. Her curated, luxurious social media persona was shattered beyond repair. Her thousands of followers vanished the moment the scandal broke. There were no more private jets, no more designer gowns, and absolutely no more free rides. In stark contrast, my own empire was thriving beyond my wildest projections. The public execution of Chloe and her parents did not damage my professional reputation, it solidified it entirely. Vivian and Julian Sterling remained my most loyal, dedicated clients. They understood the incredible value of an asset manager who possessed absolute unflinching loyalty and the ruthlessness to protect her clients at all costs. Our business partnership deepened significantly in the aftermath of the canceled wedding. Vivian trusted me implicitly, shifting the entirety of her family's domestic and international holdings directly into Apex Holdings. Within a single fiscal quarter, the massive influx of sterling capital had doubled my firm's annual revenue. I had saved them from a catastrophic parasitic attachment, and in return they cemented my position at the absolute top of the financial hierarchy. A soft chime broke the peaceful silence of my penthouse office. I glanced down at the sleek smartphone resting next to my teacup. The screen illuminated, displaying a flood of incoming notifications. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. I had exactly 47 unread emails. They were all from my mother and my sister. The subject lines were a pathetic, desperate chorus of begging. They pleaded for a second chance. They begged for a temporary loan just to get them through the month. They asked if we could just sit down and talk as a family, promising that things would be different now. I stared at the desperate digital pleas, feeling absolutely nothing but a mild, fleeting sense of boredom. Without a single second of hesitation, I tapped the screen. I hit select all. I hit delete. Then I permanently blocked their email addresses, their phone numbers, and any remaining avenues of contact. The digital trash was taken out, finalizing the eviction I had started 3 months prior. They thought that by erasing me from their perfect family portrait, they could break my spirit. But they forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who bought the canvas, paid for the paint, and owned the gallery. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't screaming or fighting, it's simply turning off the financial tap and letting toxic people drown in the reality they created. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your success? Tell me your story in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories about taking back your power. Until next time, remember, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's just the sound of a checkmate.